from Faith Builders. What's the title of it again? If anyone would follow me. It's by John Colburn. It's really good. It's just some basics, and we're looking at some of the Anabaptist history. And so today, though, for you maybe who are not into history, we're actually doing two lessons. We're going to do the Hutterites, and then we're going to pick up some of the interesting stories about the Dutch. Zach did the Dutch, some of the basics with Menno Simons and all that kind of a thing, but there's some really interesting stories. So I'm going to try not to, I brought all these books here today, and I'm going to try not to make it too much of a what a fire hydrant hose or something, and just kind of tell stories. I look at history as stories and as lessons, and I love stories, and I get real attracted to the interesting parts of the history. So those are going to be some of the things that I'm highlighting. And so we're going to talk about the Hutterites, the first part, and then we're going to pick up the latter part of the Dutch, Netherlands and all that. So let's get into the Hutterites, because a lot of people don't know about the Hutterites, and it's a fascinating part of Anabaptist history that we really should know about. So let's talk about it. So if you remember on our talk about the earliest Anabaptists, very first confession or ordnung or however you want to word it was there in Zolliken, right outside of Zurich, and there were some things that they wrote down that they thought that was very important. Excuse me. And some of those were things like that they should meet 3 or 4 times a week. I mean, these were radical Christians. They said that when you come together, let nothing be done frivolous in the household of God. That when you're there, it says in number 4 there, you should warn them according to the commands of Christ. If there is anything that I would say should bespeak who and what we're about, is that number 4, is putting the teachings of Christ into practice. They literally got around the New Testament and said, hey, it says this. Let's do that. And that's the kind of stuff they exhorted. Number 5, though, was something that's in all of the Anabaptist groups, and the Hutterites took it to the farthest point of it. But everyone had a piece of this, and it's part of Anabaptists in our DNA, our spiritual DNA. Of all the brothers and sisters of the congregation, none shall have anything of his own, but rather as the Christians in the time of the apostles held all things in common, and especially stored up a common fund from which aid can be given to the poor according as each will have need, and as in the apostles' time permit no brother to be in need. So in other words, there was always part of all the Anabaptist groups a sense of somehow of taking care of the poor and the people that are needy in the congregation. This sense is like a sense of a family, a community. It was not just a church that you went to hear preaching or just take the sacrament. It was a gathered community. All of them had this to some degree or another. Interesting, number 6 said, all gluttony shall be avoided. And number 7, interesting, it says, the Lord's Supper shall be held as often as the brothers are together. Literally, they had communion every time they got together, which is remarkable. So that's the earliest. See how this. Okay, I'm trying really, Steve. I am. Okay. Okay. So anyway, I think these are important. They're very earliest, and there's been interesting studies how if you trace out all the confessions and all the different Anabaptist groups, it seems they all were aware of this and made their adjustments from that. Okay, thanks. Remember from the first lesson, we got Felix, 1520, so 1525 is the baptism, and that's what we're celebrating, the 500th anniversary. 1527 was a big year. Felix Mons was killed. The martyrdom of Michael Sattler was killed in May. In February, they got together and made the Schleitheim Confession. And by August, they got together and formed out a martyred synod where they were going to decide to send missionaries all over Europe at that time. And then within those years, from 1525 to 1527, you started with 4 guys. They opened up the Moravia, and 12,500 people left their farms and their homes and said, I'm going, and they're heading up to Moravia. During this time, it was tough. I have that. You had missionaries going everywhere, and wasn't like they lived very good. This is, if you take the Martyr Synod, there were 60 there, 2 left in 5 years. That's a bad average. You had about a 5% chance of survival as a missionary, an Anabaptist missionary in 1527. These are the kind of terrain they were crossing. I took this outside of a bus as I was heading to the western side of Switzerland. And then you see the areas that are shaded, if you can kind of get this idea of Europe. So Zurich, you see Zurich there in the green. As you go now, Nickelsburg, Moravia was opened up, and this guy, Count Liechtenstein, opened it up and said, I'll take all you guys. I know you're getting persecuted. Come over to my place, and that's when everybody came. And they came a lot. I mean, lots of people were coming. Sorry about the mess up of the graph. And it was a time of growth. This is the castle is still there. You can see it. It was a time of growth. And then even Count Liechtenstein got baptized. I mean, it was like, okay, so we were like now having an Anabaptist country. And it was like, okay, what are we going to do with all these Jesus-following teachings? I mean, this is really going. And more people were going, more talks were happening, but there was a leader, a very influential Anabaptist leader we don't talk about enough, and his name was Balthasar Hubmaier. How many have ever heard of Balthasar Hubmaier? Okay, several of you. Okay. He was a big teacher in Zurich, kind of waffled a bit. He would go and make some confessions, and then they were going to say, okay, we're going to kill you. He said, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not an Anabaptist. But then he would recant from recanting. And anyway, but he had lots of good intentions, and he was actually very well read. If you look at even his understanding of the patristics of early Christianity, it's huge, his library and everything. He went with them. All right, I'm going with you guys. And he was there, and when he was there, he kind of waffled on the sword. And I think it's funny, his theology is not bad, except when it comes to the sword. And he started saying, hey, let's rethink this whole non-resistance thing. And he wrote a book on the sword. And interestingly enough, during that time, by the time he was published, he was already being persecuted by the Roman Catholics, and he got burned at the stake 2 months later after his book was published. On his deathbed, the Hutterian Chronicles records, or on his deathbed, on his death pyre, he recanted of his recanting again and said that he died in good faith. Anyway, Balthasar Hubmaier, we don't talk about him because he ended up losing the idea of non-resistance, but I had a friend, Timothy Miller, I think you all know him down in Florida, and he was asking me once, he said, Dean, we're awful merciful with Menno Simons with his funny view of the incarnation, but we really don't give Balthasar Hubmaier a fair shake, That's a really good point. We should probably give Hubmaier a better listening, even though, okay. All right, but during this time, so they're there, went through this persecution, they got up in Moravia, now Europe is literally falling apart, and in a big way. Suleiman the Magnificent, who was the sultan, the leader of the Muslims, and look at that hat, huh? I mean, that's a hat. But he wanted to take over the West and take over Europe. Istanbul finally fell in 1453, and now the Muslims were starting to move up. You can't really read that here, but does this do a laser? Kind of, sort of, not really. There it goes. So you can see here the darks are the different growth of the Muslim growth up into there. And so now all these Anabaptists, as they were just coming, were right there on the cuff or the line of the Muslim invasion of West and where the Anabaptists were lining up. So it was like, okay, we went from the frying pan into the fire. Well, Hungary fell in 1526, and then they started marching forward. Charles V who was born in the year 1500, had a rough life. He was a young man, young king, and he wanted to try to defeat the Muslims and also defeat the Protestants and all those kind of things. And so he was over this area in Moravia, and he said, okay, here's the thing. Every single person has to be ready to pull the sword. If the Muslims come, you'll kill them. So that's the deal, okay? You can live here, you can be citizens, but that's what you got to do. And this is when Hubmaier was like, yeah, let's rethink the sword thing. I mean, we got it good here, right? I mean, we got a nice nation here. I mean, the count or the Liechtenstein, the prince got whatever he is, got baptized, and at this time now in 1529, Suleiman is actually making an attack on Vienna, and it was brutal. It was just amazing the attack that came over them, and it ended up that they didn't take it, mainly because of winter and different things like that, and the providence of God, and they didn't take it. But during this time then, of those 12,500 Anabaptists that went there, sorry about the cheesy AI pictures. I know it's always a little creepy, but anyway, here's what I've created. That of those, only 200 said, I'm not doing this. Everybody else said, all right, I like Hubmaier's book. I'm going to waffle on the sword. And they picked up the sword. Only 200 said, I'm not doing it. And they walked around with a staff, and they called them the staffers versus the sword guys. And they said, that's it. And so finally, Charles V said, you need to get these guys out of there. And so they hit the road, and you can't really see it there, but the Chronicles, the Hutterian Chronicles, mentions that if they got out of the way of the town, they laid a blanket on the ground and said, okay, what do you got? So they put their money in there, they put whatever they have, and said, okay, we're going to now do community of goods, and we're all going to share all things in common, and this was their thing. And so that's what they did, and actually the Liechtenstein actually ran and chased them and said, you guys come back, please come back, please come back. Said, no, you know what, we're going to go. And they went on, and they kept this up, and through all these years, that's still living all things in common. So this is, if somebody could get a microphone too, Linda, this is the Altona colony that Linda came from, where my family and I lived for several years, 6 years or so, and where Stephen met his beautiful bride, and also another son of mine, Christian, has one there too. And I'm going to show you, actually, it's one of the Anabaptist groups that came in there, and to this day speak a different form of, kind of like Pennsylvania Dutch, than what you do. How many here speak Pennsylvania Dutch? Oh my, wow. Okay, now Linda, so I'm really going to owe her a lot of favors for this. But I want you to hear this. To this day, just like you preserved yours, they speak Hutterites. And it's close to your language, but listen to it. So I'm going to ask Linda some questions, and you can hear the similarities and some of the differences. So Linda, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Okay, ich bin die Linda und mein Mann heißt Steven. Wir haben 3 Kinder. Is anyone getting this?
Ja.
Ich bin geboren und aufgewachsen in Hutterites. Meine Mutter und mein Vater leben in Holweilig und die meisten von meiner Brüder und Schwestern.
What'd you have for breakfast today, Linda? Cheerios is the same in every language,
that's
right?
Embarrassing.
Okay.
A protein shake and coffee.
Okay, protein shake and tell me about your wedding.
So, unsere Hochzeit ist in June gewesen, 2016. Und eine hutterische Hochzeit fängt an, hat die Braut auf der Freiwillig, what do you call it now?
Tell about like how you have the 3 parts of the wedding, you know, like the hubba and all that. Yeah.
Usually eine hutterische Hochzeit fängt an, wo der Bauer wird zu den anderen Gemeinden fahren, seine Braut. und dann wird er sich hinterbringen. Und dann wird alle warten und der Welcome Procession haben. Und dann haben sie Hulba. Und dann im nächsten, das ist Samstag und am Sonntag werden sie die actual Hochzeit haben. Und dann just to basically Tage über celebrate. Feier.
Okay. How many of y'all are getting it? Oh, wow, okay. So what do you put in my coffee
guys.
when I ask for cream? What do you call it?
Schmont.
So, all right, thank you very much. Hear it for Linda there. She was a lot of bravery for that, a lot of bravery. We lived right, we lived right there. It was my house. And so the cafeteria's there, everyone's there, church is there, and school's there. Everybody lives around here. The farm was out, pig farm was out over there, and the business is over there. So that's the Hutterites, even to this day. All right, so let's get into some of the very interesting things. Because if there's anything to notice and get a lesson learned from the Hutterites, they were the Marine Corps of the Anabaptists. It's almost tragic that missions is such a byword, or it's not talked about as much, but they were the Marine Corps, and we can learn some lessons from the example. So, first of all, they had a dedicated ministry. They looked at this passage in Ephesians 4, where it says, "And he gave some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastors and teachers for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, and for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of faith, and to the knowledge of the Son of God, and to the perfect man, and to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ." So Peter Ritterman took this and he said, let us note carefully what we are commanded. And so again, a lot of the emphasis of the early Anabaptists is on the commands of Jesus. We're doing this because the commands of Jesus. I mean, things were really bad, but if Jesus said to go into all the world, you go into all the world. He said, Peter Ritterman, who, by the way, is the author of the book that's called The Hutterite Statement of Faith, says this, "Let us note carefully what we are commanded. Christ gives us a twofold command. First, we should gather with him as those who have been sent by him." In other words, find those who are coming to Christ. "Second, we should do our utmost to keep those who are gathered, so that they do not again become scattered and torn apart by the wolves." He goes on to discuss that we have ministry that has a calling for evangelism and ministry that has a calling for shepherding, for pastoring. And notice the command, we should have both. Now, granted, they're going to be at odds with each other. One says, we need to grow the church, we need to evangelize. The bishop is saying, I don't think so, we got enough problems right here, you know. But they worked this out because they felt it was a command, and they walked through some pretty hard times. Let me show you. So also they had an organized effort. You know, anybody ever read the book Atomic Habits? Oh, a lot of you have read Atomic Habits. What's the favorite quote in Atomic Habits? You don't raise to your what? You don't raise to your aspirations, or however it says. You fall to the level of your systems, right? They got this. So they said, okay, we believe that we should go into all the world. We should believe we should be missionaries. So every year, we're going to set a time, 2 times a year. In the summer and in the winter, we're going to send out our elders, our pastors, into the fields, and they're going to evangelize. And they did this as routine 2 times a year. They did this semi-annually, 2 times a year. And they had specific spots that they were sent out to go to. They had a system. They kept to that. You live in a Hutterite colony, and it even says this in the Chronicles, it's like clockwork. You know, they have a certain time they do the canning, a certain time they do this, and certain time they do that. Well, in those days, it was also a certain time that they went out on the mission field. And during this time of crazy persecution, they planted 100 communities spread across Europe by putting these practical applications into practice. And it was brutal. Here's a castle I went to in the Czech Republic. It's called Falkenstein. It's in the Martyr's Mirror as well. And in there, all the men were gathered in there, and all the women were left without their men. And when Peter Ritterman came back from some missionary thing, he got back, and everybody's gone. And And it was just the cruelty. And from there, they were chained and marched all the way down to the sea. And while they were being marched down, they were preaching and trying to convert people as they were being marched down. And then they were sold to to ships to do the oaring for that. And it was just cruelty. They have, actually, if you ever happen to be in the Czech Republic, there's a great museum right in that castle that shows all this. Amazing. At this time, the Catholics and the Protestants were in brutal fights against each other. Somebody had the great idea that they said, okay, here's the way we're going to settle all this. Whoever your king is, that's the religion of the country. So if your king is Protestant, you're a Protestant country. If your king is Catholic, you're a Catholic country. Enough said, all right? That should make peace, right? It didn't make peace. So now what all it means is if you want to do evangelism, you just take over the next country and kill everybody over there and become the king, and now they're all become Protestants or Catholics. So in all this war between the Catholic and the Protestants, in the middle were those who weren't Catholic or Protestants, and people like the Anabaptists were killed by them brutally. And there's terrible stories, awful stories of this. The Hutterites of all the different groups kept this. These are chronicles, they're diaries of their tales that they went through, of their early times. Matter of fact, our whole story of the first baptism in Zurich comes from the Hutterian Chronicles. And it tells the tales of these really, really hard times. And as it says, historians tell us now that if we look at what happened during the 30 Years' War, it is said between war and the pestilence and disease that followed the war, to 4.5 to 8 million deaths. I mean, that's like more combined than all the wars combined. I mean, it's just amazing. Mostly from disease and starvation. That's 60% of the population of Europe. Entire towns were just more than decimated. They were just destroyed through these brutal wars. There's stories in the Chronicles that there were times when the Hutterites were literally living in holes, little places and like caverns where they were trying to hide out just to survive as a people, trying to stay together as a church, as a community, having a vision together. They were fighting for this. And I have just 2 of the quotes from the Chronicles here that I just are staggering. There are many of them I can't even hardly read. When I put on here, I have like warning, this gets really bad about the details of the torture and that kind of a thing. But listen to these 2 journal writings that they're writing in there. Writing in here, it says, frightening reports followed one upon another that the Hungarians, the Turks, the Tartars were gaining ground. The towns of Târnu and Skitz surrendered. And so did many Hungarian lords, on some of whose estates and brothers were living. The enemy drew closer and closer, and the burning, murdering, and pillaging began. The church had to undergo great privation and terror and untold anguish of heart, such as they had never heard or had suffered before. It began when the enemy made the night raid on Sabbatish on May 3rd. Through God's providence, our people had fled into the woods, but 2 brothers who were still in the house were horribly tortured. One in particular was dreadfully burned and racked, and his tongue was torn from the back of his throat. Then both were hacked to death. Oh, I guess this was a little... The tremendous loss, this is not another one, 1619. The tremendous loss and damage to the church of the Lord in this year is beyond all description. In the end, the misery and terror in the country exceeds anything in human memory. There were no safety anywhere. The enemy attacked us in the north and in the south and finally all over the country. We had to flee from our house, and we were not safe on the roads or footpaths, not even in the woods. We were endangered not only from the enemy, but from the peasants. And in some places, when the enemy were gone, the peasants were even worse. Everyone was out to rob. There was no sparing of the old, the sick, the mothers, the newborn babies, or the young children. For many weeks we went from place to place through the woods and villages, suffering want, misery, and death. Report of terror called to the next. It is impossible to overstate the depth of the needs and pain we suffered. May God-fearing people wish they might die rather than see the great misery of our poor little flocks and hear the shameful violation of our women and girls. Truly, it seemed as if God, the Lord, had sent the destroyer over Moravia. These were tough times. But then this, a year after that, what you just read, you turn the page in the journal and it says this. But this year too, we followed the example of our forefathers. By sending out several brothers to various places in Germany, they went to seek those on fire for the truth and to call people to repentance. It amazed many people in Bohemia, where both hostile armies were encamped, the Catholics and the Protestants, as well as in Germany, that our defenseless members set out during a time of such terrible danger when scarcely anyone, whether of high or low estate, could travel in safety. But the Lord was their protector. They relied on Him alone. When their task was completed through the intercession of His people, He led them home again, at least some of them at least. I mean, what in the world? I mean, it's a time to hide, right? It's a time to, but if we're going through all this trouble because of the teachings of Christ, how can we ever forget it? So even in this terrible time, they had an obligation to missions that they would not let go, and it produced these 100 communities. It was a great time of, during this time and after this, it got a little better, and they were able to develop into some different trades, and they were famous for their pottery and their beautiful things. This is from a museum in Vilkaver in the Czech Republic. Years ago, when I first got up to Altona, I had a chance to visit the oldest Hutterite community in America. It's Bonham in South Dakota. And in there, they've got the actual handwritten, you see there, copy of the Chronicles under the bishop's bed in that old wooden box. So I was like, okay, I got to go see this. So I went there with some of the guys, and I said, hey, is there any way you'd let me see this? And sure enough, he brought it out. This is a picture I took. And as I'm going through there, the one page that I wanted to see was the martyrs page. It's this. And in here, it mentions all the cities or regions, and then how many martyrs were killed in that area. And so I wanted to find that in the original. And when I got to it, I noticed something odd. You see anything different from the original than this copy? What is it? Space? Who said it? Space for more. It's like that place in your Bible for baptism and marriages, except for them it was martyrdoms. And I looked at it, and I turned the page, I said, there's a gap in every region, and then whole sections. And I turned to the bishop there, and I said, do you ever notice these spaces before? He said, no, I've never noticed it before. I said, why do you think that's there? He said, well, I don't know. I said, well, I think you were supposed to be added into this. He kind of laughed, with a little Hutterite nervous laugh. But it was, can you imagine that that's the mentality of the people as they were living there, and they're writing this stuff down. There's going to be more. We're going to keep this faith, and it's going to go like that. Get up close to the 1700s, the Muslims are attacking again. They're once again trying to take Vienna in 1683, and it gets bad again and bad in war. Finally, through persecution, through disease, through everything, all the Hutterites are wiped out, and they're ending up in like 400 in this little town I visited in Vintage, Romania. And they're dying there of disease. Half of them die over the winter. And finally, it gets down in here, in this area. They eke out a living, and there's like 30 left on earth. That's it. Hutterites were almost wiped out by disease, persecution, famine. But then, in this area, beautiful area of Carinthian Austria, a revival broke out. And in that revival, some people started saying, hey, Jesus meant every word He said. And so let's take the words of Jesus, and they wouldn't go to war, they wouldn't swear oaths, and next thing you know it, they're finding themselves in trouble, and Maria Teresa says, no, you can't do that. I'll tell you what, I'll give you all 130 acres. I'll go to this area in Romania, modern-day Romania, and I'll give you 130 acres, just one thing, swear allegiance to Maria Teresa. Can't do it. So this new group said, okay, well, we won't take the 130 free acres. We'll just, I don't know, we'll eke out a living. We're going to follow Jesus. No compromise. So they were, oh, there's the area there, Carrington. And so they were there. You can't hardly see this. And they were working at this whiff farm, one of the lasting of the 40 or 30 Hutterites, and they were just cleaning out the barn, doing odd jobs or something, and they found this trunk. And in the trunk, they found these writings. And they said, well, I'm just curious. We've been reading these writings, and is this you? I mean, is this, you did all this stuff? I mean, the missions and all that? And they were like, yeah, that's the way we used to be. And they said, well, why not do it again? And they were like, okay. No, I don't know what they said, but eventually from that little revival and finding those writings, they said, let's do this again, and the Hutterites get kick-started again in the 1750s. Finally, they're evangelizing, they're doing missions again, they're crossing, they're getting into trouble again, persecution, so finally they decide they're going to cross that mountain, and there's a story of that, of them, I'm sure there's got to be probably a little happier places to cross than that spot, but they finally come over and they finally make it into the modern-day Ukraine area. Sending people back to them, they say, okay, we got to now save all the rest of the people that have been scattered through the years. Let's go save our people. And here you can see all those little black spots on the Ukraine? Those were German settlements of any kind in that Ukraine area. And actually both the Hutterites and the Russian Mennonites were right here together in this area. So, interesting. They went back then. They were there. They didn't just live their life. They went back and they brought more people back in. The Walters, the Mendels, the Cheddars, the Woolmans were persuaded to join them back again, and they came back. The Deckers and the Gross, those were joined, came all and joined them in there. And everything gets kick-started again until finally you get to the 1870s, and the changes in Russia and all that happened, that they lost their non-resistance status. And these two young men, the Cheddars, Lorenz and Paul Cheddar, came and had a meeting with not General Grant, but President Grant, and said, hey, with the Russian Mennonites, can we come here and have conscious objector status? And President Grant said, no, but don't worry, we won't have a draft for 50 years, which is a little weird because we didn't. But that's what they told them. They came anyway, and they ended up getting killed, of course, and martyred in World War I. But it's amazing. So the last two quotes, I'll give you this, then we're going to hit the Dutch. Beautiful passage from Peter Riddeman. He says this. He talks about fellowship. I love this quote. He says, anyone who starts a fire knows it's like this. When you first start a fire, when it's a small fire, any sticks that you put on it will snub it out. If you put a big stick on it, it's going to snub it out. But if you let the fire get big, then you can throw big logs and whole houses and everything on that, and it'll keep burning. He said, that's like the love and the brotherhood. If our love is small, the smallest little offenses will snub out your love. But if you let your love burn, we can take all kinds of offenses and all kinds of things. Isn't that amazing? It's an amazing quote. And then finally, this last quote I'll give you. School teacher, Hieronymus Calls, who wrote this big prayer that the Hutterites still read to this day before supper. He was a school teacher. He went out as a missionary, and he was captured and martyred. He wrote a letter back to the church, and he said, I want you to get this. And this is what they said. So let's take it to us. He says this. This is 1590, 1580, I don't know, something around that time. Many in our time think the opposition has ended. They look back and they think the war is over. But they are deceived. If they would live the life, they would get persecuted again. As long as a lion has its cub with him, he might act friendly and playful enough. But when he loses his little one, see the mission coming out of it? But when he loses his little ones or his prey, he cannot keep himself back. He rages and roars. He rants and raves as only like lions can until fire shoots from his eyes. Certainly, Peter does not warn us in vain that Satan comes upon us like a roaring lion or a wolf at nightfall. But may God be praised. The Lion of the tribe of Judah is bigger and stronger than the Lion of the Philistines. He has already split the other lion's head and wounded his body. Therefore, he knows that his time is short and he will soon be overcome. Therefore, he is desperate. He's angry. He sees a lake of fire into which he will be thrown. And here's our call to us. Watch yourself, therefore, heroes of Israel. Take courage, strong men of Zion. Rejoice, O city of Jerusalem. The time of your triumph is near. All tears will be washed away from your eyes. The reward of your labor stands ready. Just hold on a little while longer. The fat cattle have already been butchered. The fowls have all been plucked. The table stands ready. And the guests, those martyrs, have already begun to arrive. Amen. So that's amazing. Hutterites today live mainly now in the western part of the United States and in Canada, and it's my prayer that this visionary, this missionary calling that's built right into the statement of faith is once again lived out. All right. Any questions? Okay. Now, real quick on just some things I wanted to add about the Dutch. You already heard, so you who weren't here, Zach did a great job of going through the Dutch and talking about Menno Simons and some of the origins of the Dutch Mennonites. But there's some lessons that I think we better listen. There's some interesting things that went on in the Netherlands that I just think that we better hear. So, again, if you kind of know where this is the European region, the shaded areas are different Anabaptist groups. And the Dutch were kind of weird. You know, in the Swiss, it was kind of easy. You had big debates that then led to this group, and you had this group over here doing the Hutterites over here, the Swiss Brethren were here, the Pilgrim Marpeck group was there, and all that. The Dutch was all kind of mixed together. But if you look at your map of Europe, if you kind of know where Netherlands is, so there's Europe. You can see Italy with the boot. That orange on the top is Netherlands. We call it Holland. Holland is actually just one state where Amsterdam is, but it's more properly called Netherlands, which just literally means the lowlands. So you get there, and now here's here's a close-up of the Netherlands. And I want you to understand that it's a bunch of little different provinces. And that meant a lot to them. As a matter of fact, different European nations criticized them of their local autonomy. And I think a lot of times as people study Dutch Mennonite history, they miss this point because the Dutch Mennonites really cared about local autonomy. Especially from things that were happening in Amsterdam, you know, don't put that on me, was kind of something. Also, right under Netherlands is Belgium. Anybody ever been to Holland or Belgium? Okay, all right, Marvin. All right. Right under Holland is Belgium, and that area on the north of Belgium is Flanders. So you had this area where incredible persecution was going through, that yellow part on there where Antwerp is, and that became part of it. So these regions brought up people and refugees, and when you usually start studying Dutch Mennonite history, you get this dizzying group of all these different groups. You're like, okay, wait, hold it. And all these different names and all these different splits, and it's just kind of crazy. And finally you're like, okay, it doesn't make any sense to me. They just were very factious. A bit true, but I do think it's more, well, maybe not more, it's at least some part of it is that they really, why join together? They had different autonomous groups, autonomous regions, and I don't think that's discussed enough. Okay, but now I'm going to show you some cool stuff that I've found in some of my recent Dutch history. This is Rembrandt's house. Anybody ever heard of Rembrandt, the famous painter? Okay, this is his house. There's a museum there today. And in there's an interesting painting. It's this one. Inside there, and it's a Mennonite young man. And it's made by a guy who raised in a Mennonite home, Govert Flink, and he was painting a young Mennonite named Dirk Lauwe, however you say that. But interesting, as they did research on it in 2008, they realized that the painting had been changed. Do you see that? So here's what you see when you go into the museum, but when the researchers started to look at it in 2008, they realized that it had usually had a big old collar, red socks, and all that kind of a thing, and somebody altered it. So when I found this, of course, I'm writing a dissertation about enforcement of dress standards on the Mennonites, and so when I got this, of course, I thought, this is awesome, right? So it's interesting looking at this, and it opens up an interesting question of some of the questions that we deal with, of materialism, of dress standards, of all those kind of things. It's kind of interesting to see how much those discussions have always been around us from the very beginning, and how people have treated those. And so it's believed by these art historians that this painting was deliberately changed to make it more modest to Mennonite dress standards. So here is in the city in Amsterdam, you had the more progressive. They were surgeons, they were artists, they were engineers, they were shipbuilders. And particularly, here's one, Jacob Cornelissen. Anyway, he was a surgeon. He also was famous for his facial surgery. He published medical works, was as rare in his time. And he was also the pastor, one of the pastors at the famous Waterlander Church there in Amsterdam. But it's interesting how serious they took things like dress, but it's also interesting to see how they dealt with it in their church. You're thinking, okay, how did they do it back in the day? So here in this one, he wrote the first book we ever have in the Anabaptists on dress, and it's called The Adornment and Ornament of the Pious Woman. He says, always bear in mind the common saying that it doesn't matter what you wear is false and rests upon a bad foundation. But just as all reasonable people who let go of their desires when they have lost moderation in clothing, so also should those who, like peacocks, raise their tails in vanity, though they may think that they still perfectly uphold moderation. Therefore, I cannot refrain from addressing you on this matter and placing before you a mirror. He says, look at yourself from head to toe, your clothing, your adornments, your gold rings on your fingers, your golden ear ornaments, your pearls in your ears, your golden pins in your hair. All of these bear living testimony that you disregard the words of Paul or that you do not fear God. This was the Waterlanders. But did the Waterlanders, though, make standards about that? Interesting. They did not. But as for me, since it is not my office to determine the duties of such high office as to set rules regarding clothing, it is even less my place to censure those who, in my judgment, exceed the limits in this matter. In other words, we found that the Mennonites up in the country areas had these clear standards. The Waterlanders made a very clear point. They absolutely do not. In the 1590s, the Waterlanders and some of the more the group of Swiss brethren, but they were more the Pilgrim Marpeck circle, and other ones in the North Germany got together and they had a conference. It's the first time we get some of these things that we deal with in our churches today, and it brings up this idea of both wealth and clothing. It says, furthermore, we have discussed our apprehensions concerning the growing indications of merchant class towards temporal greed and the vanity of ostentation clothing. And we imitate the world rather than displaying the humility of Christ. And because these are insidious, creeping sins, and it is to be feared that they will lead many to destruction. But although one can hardly prescribe for anyone how much business he should do or what he should wear, yet we desire that each of us would restrict his business activities and dress modestly, indeed, that he might enlighten the world in all that he does, and not attire himself like the world after the manner discontented and insatiable. And then he says, though, and the pastors, for this reason we have agreed that all who keep watch over the house of God should censor the members in all faithfulness and in the power of the Scriptures, and thereby keep them pure from the perdition and the disobedient, and in all the way each brother admonishes the other, but with a fatherly heart, so that the admonitions will be more tolerable. So it's interesting that in the city churches, they were very severe on their preaching about dress and things like that, materialism, worldly things like that, but it was very clear about not drawing lines. In the area, see where up top there it says the Friesens and the Groningans up here was a different story. I won't read through all of them, but they had 20, and we have the first actual detailed list of drawing lines in their congregations. And they did this, and they go through many things about your house, your lifestyle. It says, and those who would dare have themselves a portrait painted of themselves. They saw what was happening in Amsterdam, and they seemed very concerned about it. Here's the first one, that a Christian ought not to wear crimson cloth or dyed fabric or any smooth five-shaft woven cloth, apparently kind of cloth. So it's interesting then seeing, as the Mennonites progressed, the two ways. And it's just, there's lessons, there's got to be some lessons in there. Just for this lesson, I Googled the Dutch capitalism, and Dutch is considered the father of capitalism. And that picture that's on this book that I just found yesterday, I haven't read it yet, The Pioneers of Capitalism, the guy on the left, leaning over, he's a Mennonite, painted by Rembrandt. That guy. That guy. And as we see that, it's interesting to see that as the Mennonites ended up, that the persecution ended there quicker than it did in the South. And they were able to have very good businesses. They found themselves right smack dab in the beginning of modern capitalism. Shipping was going everywhere, and suddenly everybody was doing really good. The cloth merchant was good. The writers were good. The shipbuilders were doing really good, and everything was doing really good, and they became rich and richer and like Elon Musk level rich. It's interesting when we read Menno Simons. They were emphatically not Hutterite. Matter of fact, I think it was the Munsterites that forced the Dutch even further away from community of goods. But he was very also concerned that as we grow wealthy, we have to be extremely careful about what happens next. And he gave us all these warnings that for time's sake I won't read through them. But just about that this is going to cause within us, we have to be able to, God gives us this money so that we can pour it out and keep pouring it out. And this was, what are we going to do if this starts to happen? But the Dutch got richer. And these are all Mennonite paintings of famous Mennonites. This was a map maker he had a monopoly on map making, became fabulously wealthy. Was one of the ones also painting by Rembrandt. This guy, a cloth salesman, got fabulously wealthy. To the point that then we were non-resistant, but we're always at war with France or with England. And they got so rich. This isn't just help your brother out. This is like help your country out. And they literally made loans to the Dutch Republic so that they could go to war. And so during all this, they're like, okay, we're not, this is the Waterlanders, not so much, well, you had different ones in this area, but they're growing in all these compromises and trying to, little things after little things are affecting them. And then finally, the stock market. You got a boat. In those days, maybe it's still to this day, you have stocks in a boat. You own parts of the boat. And these boats do incredible trades. And Dutch was going to all these different countries and doing trading and all this. But there's one leg of the trade that was a little different. So part of the trade would see you would just bring your manufactured goods to Africa, and amen, you're sending it off. But then enslaved slaves was then being sent to America, dropped off there, and then raw materials were being brought back to Europe. And people slowly, who were getting involved in the shipping stock market, started getting more and more wealthy and started turning a blind eye. And next thing you know it, you had Dutch Mennonites one's a deacon in the Waterlander church, involved an owner of slave ships. And it became more and more and more of the hypocrisy of what was happening as they became wealthier and wealthier. And somehow, the core, what if Jesus really meant every word he said? Yes, the scriptures are clear. The community of goods is not a command. It's what we see in the book of Acts as one application. But even Jesus received donations from wealthy patrons. But here, the bottom line is what does God give us money for? What's the purpose? What are we doing with the money? And suddenly it just kept getting more and making more was something that happened. Eventually, the very city of the Dutch made the newspapers, and they started just to mock the opulence of the Dutch. And there's an article I read just recently that not only did the Dutch get rich, the rich joined the Mennonites. I mean, the Dutch Mennonites got rich, but the people said, if you're going to be rich, you're going to join the Mennonites. Here's a painting or an etching of a wedding. I'm almost done. And it's good you can't see it from there because it's about what happens at a Mennonite wedding when you eat too many beans. It's pretty bad if you look up close. So just mockery. But then something interesting happened that's maybe never happened in history. And I'll finish with this and we'll be done. All that time, the Swiss were still under great persecution. The Dutch actually did amazing, writing the letters. They were both Calvinist Reformed. So the Switzerland was Calvinist Reformed. The Dutch was now Calvinist Reformed. The Dutch were writing the Swiss, going, go easy on the Hutterites and on the Swiss Brethren. And there's actually a letter that says, why do you worry about the Hutterites and the Swiss Brethren? And it mentions them. But finally, the Bern and Switzerland said, we've had enough of them. And they put all the Amish and the Mennonites on a boat, and they sent them out. But even before that, here I have this quote. In 1644, they had this, we're going to take all of the Anabaptists, we're going to gather together, we're going to stick their children in an orphanage. And the king was gone in the day that he proclaimed this. I've been into this church building. And on the day that it proclaimed, a thunderstorm raged over the country, and a stone from the cathedral fell right down on the Burgermeister, not the king, the Burgermeister's chair, and demolished it. And everybody's like, uh-oh, and they cooled off for a little bit, but eventually they got it going again. Finally, by 1710, they're saying, out with all of you, done with it all. And they put them all on boats. Now, we have from Bern, remember they're in the mountains, down river ends into the Netherlands. You ever wonder who was on that boat? Here's some names, not all of them. Gerald Mast wrote an article. The refugees on this boat carried names such as Eberle, Gerber, Habiger, Horst, Kropf, Meyer, Miller, Moser, Risser, Raber, Roth, Rupp, Schirk, Schmidt, Schleba, Schwarzentruber, Swammer, Stutzman, Wanger, just to name a few, he says. I'm curious, in this room, how many have any of that in your family? Raise your hand. Look around. All of them were on that boat. Kept out of that. And now, all this years of persecution continuing, they're dumped onto the Dutch Mennonite with all that opulence. And it was a scandal even to the country. Look at this. They land there, and they're writing about the way they looked like when they came out. The conditions of the exiles were pitiful. They had spent 20 days in confining quarters of the ship. Luckily, they had injured. They were inured, and they were used to hardship. Their outward appearance caused surprise. They had long beards, which had never been cut. They wore unusual clothing and heavy shoes, which were shod with iron and studded with great nails. Later, 5 more shiploads followed, so that the number of exiles increased to about 450. What was one to do with all these strangers here in the Netherlands? And they dumped them in on the Mennonite churches. This guy, Peter Lenergic, was a satirist, and he wrote of just how ridiculous it was. And he wrote this satire poem in the newspaper in Holland when he saw the comparison of the Swiss brethren being dumped on to the Dutch Mennonites. And he's giving it as the story of a young Swiss brethren or Amish girl walking around as the poem is written this way. The beautiful simplicity has disappeared from Minnows Church. At least for the most part, it has recently appeared here again. But not in fine garments nor rustling with silk, rather plainly and properly covered in a warm farmer's coat. Perhaps someone may argue that the real problem is not the clothing, but the frivolous hearts that lie beneath. That vanity is not in the lace or the ribbons, but in the high hats and the tight collars. That everyone should dress according to their status, the poor in coarse fabrics and the rich in fine silks. It is true one could make such an argument, but more often than that, the luxurious garments is simply a mirror of the heart. Trumped in vanity and ensnared by the world's temptation, and through pride could still lurk beneath the humble dress, yes it could, it is the glittering attire that most often hides the darkest of sins. Is this really Minnows people, he writes? Come, let's leave this place, the little girl is saying. Alas, I am horrified. Oh, my brothers in faith, how dare you so boldly trample simplicity underfoot? You have strayed from the narrow way. Turn back. Set your feet once more upon the path paved by the martyr's blood of Jesus. Think back just 150 years ago. Look what you have become, and compare yourself to your forefathers. And they left. So they ended up in the area, and finally they immigrated into America. When I was there, this is a slide I took from when I was in Amsterdam, and an archivist was giving, and this is the slide he had there. It's interesting. The next slide, I got to show you this, was this, and he was showing what happened when the people got to America. And as I was there, you see the top left picture. I don't know how many of you realize that I'm sitting there with Leroy Beachy and Eddie Klein and Binyal Lapp and those guys. And I'm there, and Binyal Lapp raises his hand and he says, "Curious, where'd you get that picture?" And the guy said, I don't know. I got it off the internet or something. Why? He said, "Yeah, that's me." It's literally a picture of Binyal Lapp's ice cream store. I don't know if you've ever been there, but anyway, the story is amazing. And I'll leave this last quote, and then I'll turn it back over. It was during that time, right at that change, that the Martyr's Mirror was written. And it was written to kind of wake us up, just like that satirist. By the way, that satirist on his deathbed converted and became a Mennonite. Go figure. He wrote this during that time to try to just wake us up to remember the values of what we came from. And he says this in the introduction to the Martyr's Mirror. And I'll be done. These are sad times in which we live. Nay, truly, there is more danger now than in the time of our fathers, who suffered death in the testimony of the Lord. Few will believe this, because the great majority look to that which is external and corporal. And in this respect, it is now better, quieter, and more comfortable. Few only look to that which is internal and pertains to the soul, and on which everything depends. So as we ponder our life and the example, both that we get from the Hutterites and for the example of the Dutch Mennonites and the preservation of your ancestors who survived through all of that temptation and persecution and made it, I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from both of these groups. And as we now look at the Wall Street Journal and realize that the Holmes County has now been shown as the most prosperous county in America, we're not loaning to the government yet, but what are we going to do that's different than the Dutch Mennonites? And as we look at the example of the Hutterites and the example of missions, what are we going to do to answer the same question that they had asked? What if Jesus really meant every word he said? Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for these examples of these faithful believers in our past. And this is a new age, new temptations, new ways, new things. We can't live in the past. But God, I know that the same truth prevails today. Be with us now, Father, to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints, that you would be glorified in all that we do. In Jesus' name.